Good morning. Good morning. Just to let you guys know, my name is Arthur Jones. I'm a current senior here at the J. William and Mary Deidre College of Communication, advertising major, Arabic minor. So just a couple words before Marjorie comes up. Mentorship is the ability to give back, especially to the universe when it's given to you. I just have to say Marjorie has done that, and she continues to do that in her everyday service as a public service journalist. During our time together, I saw the passion that Marjorie has about this topic and telling the stories of the people who live and face and function in poverty. I saw her spend a plethora of times checking stats, reviewing journals, also hunting down lawmakers, we won't name any people, and developing relationships with families who struggle with poverty. She's a hardworking, objective, passionate, and I have to say this again, passionate journalist, committed to giving voice to people who all go without being heard. So with that being said, I'm going to give this podium to my mentor, Ms. Marjorie Valbrun, 2014-15 O'Brien Fellow.
I came by the story in a really winding way. So Bill Clinton signed a welfare reform bill into law on August 22nd, 1996. And he famously said the legislation, which was officially called the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, very exciting. He called it a historic opportunity to end welfare as we know it. And that became a big, big buzzword. At the time, the president said, "This bill is a real step forward for our country, for our values, and for people on welfare. It should represent not simply the ending of a system that too often hurts those it's supposed to help, but the beginning of a new era in which welfare will become what it was meant to be, a second chance, not a way of life." Clinton also predicted that the new law would transform the broken welfare system, and it was really broken. He said the larger goal of the law, however, was to eventually break the chronic cycle of intergenerational poverty and dependency among poor families by drastically changing the economic circumstances and mindsets that trapped children, kept them tethered to government assistance, and virtually guaranteed that they would remain on welfare into adulthood. So it was a very long and lofty speech, and it went on and on and on. But Clinton might have well have just said two things: end welfare as we know it, and welfare should not be a way of life. Those were the sentiments that most resonated with people, opponents and proponents of the law. It was also what the media seized on. So at the time, I was a reporter who had already spent, a good part of my career writing about people living on the margins of society, people trying and failing repeatedly to climb up the economic ladder, people stuck in low-wage jobs, dead-end jobs, people scraping by in the underground economy. So I'd come to understand a thing or two about the complexity of entrenched poverty and the real difficulty of overcoming it. I knew that passing a law was one thing and implementing it was another, and that getting the intended outcomes was yet another. So I set out to find out how this law was going to work and spent nearly a year chronicling it as it was being rolled out across the country. At the time, I was living in Philadelphia and working for the Philadelphia Inquirer. So I met all these women, these so-called welfare mothers, who had been on public assistance for years and even decades, who were now being told they had to get jobs or work training and to learn to fend for themselves. So I followed them to skills development classes, resume writing workshops, worker recruitment centers, job interviews. I took buses with them and subways. I went door to door with them as they kept having doors slammed in their faces because they had very spotty work records. They hadn't worked in years. They were very low or undereducated. And along the way, I learned their life stories. So I went, they told me, how they were born into poor families, how they were raised in poor neighborhoods, how they had gone to poor schools, how they had children while they were young and unmarried, or married the wrong man, how they dropped out of high school or didn't complete college, how they'd work on and off and here and there for low pay, developing spotty work records and very few marketable skills, how they had dreams but had not known how to achieve them, how they'd been the victims of sexual or physical abuse or lived with domestic violence, and how those experiences had led to crippling depression or drug or alcohol addictions, how they tried to reach for better lives and at some point just gave up trying. So these were people with little or no social capital. They lacked connections to gain entry into the job market. They lacked the skills to get the types of jobs that could really pull them out of poverty and keep them out of poverty. They were scared to death about what welfare reform meant, what it would do to their already precarious lives, and more importantly, the lives of their children. And they had a good reason to be afraid. So I got to really understand how complicated and deeply layered and challenging all this stuff was, laws and how laws, impact people's lives, And at some point, it became clear to me that just how many hurdles the law was going to have to overcome to really help these women change their lives and alter the trajectory of the lives of their children. And even after I moved on to other assignments and to other states, I would think about these women over the years a lot. And I wondered, how did they make out? How did their children fare? And as the years turned into decades, I felt compelled to find out if they had indeed broken the cycle of poverty that defined their lives. And so nearly 20 years later, I found out about the O'Brien Fellowship, and I said, I better go find these women. And I felt it was a great opportunity to revisit something that I felt that had not really changed. And it was great timing because, it's like 50 years, well, I guess now it's 51 years after the war on poverty. Income inequality is something we talk about all the time. I think President Obama said it was one of the defining issues of our era. So, and now it's 20 years after the law, and the social consequences of one of, I think, the most ambitious and unprecedented social policy experiments since the war on poverty are still evolving. So, and even still, lawmakers, anti-poverty experts, academics, social workers, social scientists, and even some of the people who helped draft the legislation that became the law, they still don't agree on it. They can't say whether it successfully moved poor women out of poverty, and more importantly, whether it led their children to self-sufficiency. The indications are that the law has done neither. We know welfare rolls across the country are at historical lows. I mean, we saw the numbers shrinking, and early on, people were saying this was a booming success because the economy was doing really, really good. But after a while, people stopped tracking them. The economy changed. I mean, when you have people with college degrees and advanced degrees who can't get jobs, you have to wonder what happened to people who left welfare and were working in low-wage jobs. Some people say they went from being just poor to very poor to extreme poor. Some say that they're just surviving on the margins of the economy. Some of them are just now joining the masses of the working poor. So when Clinton signed the law, there were 12.6 million Americans receiving monthly cash assistance payments. Last year, the number was 3.5 million. So far this year, the average monthly caseload is 3.2 million people. And that's about 1.4 million families and 2.4 million children. And what we don't know is what happened to all these people who left welfare. There was no formal system established to track them once they left welfare, and welfare researchers who've long argued that low-paying jobs that provided few, if any, worker benefits and no opportunities for upward mobility would never break the cycle of poverty. And they say the welfare recipients were merely moved out of state-sanctioned poverty into private sector-funded poverty. Or perhaps they got off welfare and into other government programs. In either case, they say most former welfare recipients went from being merely poor to very poor, and that their now young adult children are not much better off. And so as proof, they can point to all these different numbers. There are 15 million people living below half the poverty line, which for a family of four right now is 24,250. Former welfare families are the bulk of that population who are living below half the poverty line. There's also a huge increase in families who rely on the supplemental assistance or nutrition program, which is what we used to call food stamps. And they are reporting that's their sole source of monthly income, just the food stamps. They have nothing else. There are 7.5 million families who are in this category. But beyond the numbers, there are lots of personal stories of struggle and triumph, of former welfare mothers trying to get out and stay out of poverty, and their now grown children determined to make their way into the middle class. And so my project hasn't run yet, but it will run hopefully next month. And it's, what we're calling is the children of welfare. If the whole purpose of the law was to break the cycle, we're going to see I think that what I've done is to show what has happened to the children. The mothers, for the most part, are still struggling. Some of the children are doing better, some are not. And so what I've tried to do is draw conclusions based on all kinds of different studies and all kinds of different examples, but there's been no longitudinal study that said, here's the story, here it is definitively. So my stories will just introduce you to some of the people that I spent this past year with, and they were all women in Wisconsin and their families. So I'll show you some of their pictures and tell you some of their stories. Okay, so, and some of the women are here, and I'm so glad they're here, and you're going to meet some of them later in the afternoon panel. So Lily Sherman, let's see, oops. Okay, so she moved to Milwaukee in '95 with her 2 young children. That's her daughter Hannah, who was a toddler at the time, and she has a son, Hakeem, and she has a younger daughter who was born after they arrived here. And they came expecting to stay with family until they could get on their feet. She was living in Chicago. She was leaving an abusive partner who also, was struggling with addiction. And so she came to stay with family, figured they could stay for, a month or 2, and within 3 days they were in a homeless shelter because the family, it was friends of a family. They said, we can't put you all up. This is her and the 3 children. So she's worked as a cashier at a Sam's Club warehouse, as a teacher's aide, at 2 local charter schools. She's worked as a certified nursing assistant at various nursing homes throughout the city. She worked at a residential center for children and adults with disabilities and people in recovery for drug and alcohol addictions. She did clerical work, customer service work for professional staffing agencies. She's worked at a local state farm insurance agency as part of a work training program subsidized by the state welfare program. She did telemarketing for a professional fundraising company. She worked as an account specialist for a collection agency. She's worked her way off welfare, but she's never made a living wage. None of the jobs paid enough to lift her or her family out of poverty. They're still struggling today. Hakeem is the young man, he's 23. Hannah, the one in the middle, is 22. They're in college, and their outlook for their future is promising. And Hakeem in particular is very, very determined to not ever live one day in poverty. And so he's very goal and future oriented. I mean, he's a really hard worker. And she's done a really good job of protecting them from all that she's struggled with. But she's still struggling, and recently she had to reapply for food stamps. Next is Linda Ray. Linda is here with one of her daughters. So Linda, she raised 3 children, mostly on her own, and has spent much of her life fighting for the rights and dignity of welfare mothers. And she's been a very vocal and visible spokesperson for the Welfare Warriors, which was a group that was very active during the pitched battles of the welfare reform era. She wrote op-eds for newspapers. She appeared on national television on the Phil Donahue Show, the Maury Povich Show. And in the face of really hostile and unrelenting criticism of women like her, she made the case eloquently, intellectually, and in great detail why welfare moms and their children were deserving of federal assistance. She explained how the economic system works against the poor and how welfare moms were being demonized and scapegoated for wasting tax dollars and using up federal funds when in truth, less than 1% of the federal budget went to welfare payments. And this paled in comparison to the amount of the federal budget that went to corporate welfare. This is her with her family. That's her son and the grandchildren around her. That's 2 of the grandbabies. I think there are 5? 5? No, you have 5 grandkids. Yes. Oh, congratulations. Okay. So Linda's parents kicked her out when she was very young, I think 12. And she spent her formative years on and off the streets being exploited and abused by men who prey on young girls like her. As a result, she spent a lot of time, fighting depression and other mental health issues. You'll meet her later at the afternoon panel. But for now, I'll show you a little clip of her and show you how fierce she is on the Phil Donahue show some 20-something years ago.
I want to say it's when you have to give up all those benefits to go to work, you become poorer than not working at all. And that's what we have to stop.
Would you be penalized if you married the man with whom you live now?
I certainly would.
So you're not getting married because it would cost you money and benefits?
And my fiance is a poor working class man, and he pays he's one of the few rare guys who does pay child support on his daughter from a previous marriage, and he pays his child support for his daughter, but he can't afford to support my other 2 children.
If you got married, what would happen?
I would lose all of my child support automatically.
That would not happen in New Jersey.
We're the only mothers, we're the only group of mothers who lose their child support if we either choose to work or choose to marry.
Yes.
We lose our child support entirely.
And what state is this?
Wisconsin.
Wisconsin.
And the next clip is just, they had a lot of welfare moms in the audience, and some of them were, in support of the women on the panel, but others were like, no, it was bad, and they said they didn't like the system. I've yet to meet anyone whether they were on welfare or not. I'm sorry, anybody on welfare, whether they felt it was a good system or not, who liked the idea of being on welfare. I mean, they all hated the system. They hated the fact that they had to answer to someone, that somebody was, clocking everything that they did. So this is just a clip of a.
Okay, I'm in trouble because I'm older, and I heard somebody say she got married 3 years later, so the way off is get married. A woman is a man away from welfare, so thank you for saying that. I was a battered woman, and I talk to battered women all the time, and here's another double message, which is leave your batterer. Leave your batterer so your children can starve. And when I asked my children who were beaten, who were shot at with me, when I asked them which was worse, the battering or the poverty, living in cold, not having the clothes other kids had, being homeless 3-4 times in their lives, they say the poverty.
The other woman you saw on there was former Congresswoman, I think it was Lynn Woolsey, and she was a former welfare mom, and she talked about the stigma behind being on welfare, that she had this very upper middle class life, and then her husband left her and the children, and she had to rely on welfare and fight her way back. And she was there to really try to explain just again like how complicated the situation is, how policies are contradictory, how the government tells you to get on your feet, but the minute you get a job they won't give you child care. So if you don't have child care, you can't get a job because you just don't want to take care of your kids. And it's just a very kind of never-ending loop of problems and stresses. And so when people say, why can't they just get a job, it's a lot more complicated than people think. And so another person I spent a lot of time with was Jacqueline Ward. She's also here. And Jacqueline is a former welfare rights activist turned nonprofit manager. She's a fledgling entrepreneur. She's now all about wealth building and economic empowerment. After cycling on and off welfare for about a decade as a single mother of 2, She became determined to make a life where economic security and financial independence were tangible and accessible goals. This is her with her oldest daughter, Jessica, not too far from her office. Today, Jacqueline is executive director of the Fonding North Economic Development Corporation. That's where she implements and supports community development projects in the North Avenue Marketplace Business Improvement District. It's an economically distressed area of the city's north side. She's also the managing director of that Business Improvement District, or BID. It's a public-private partnership between the city of Milwaukee and property owners. She provides technical support to businesses and works with community partners to promote business development opportunities and revitalize the commercial corridor. She also runs her own company, CCEL Venus Consulting, LLC. It's a project management firm specializing in community development projects. Prior to her current position, she was a financial awareness program coordinator for the Wisconsin Women's Business Initiative Corporation. Her long-term goal is to be completely self-employed, and she constantly encourages her daughters Jessica and Tatiana to have the same objective. And Jacqueline is part of my story that just shows how she got from here to there. That past life, she doesn't even think about it right now at all. She's all about, teaching her daughters to get what they want, to go after it, to be their own bosses, to write their own history, and not have people define who you are. And so you'll meet Jacqueline later today at the afternoon panel. So Ngozi, who's also here, represents this, I guess, the generation that I'm talking about, the younger people. The young people who came of age during the battles of welfare reform. So that's a picture of her and her siblings. She is one of 7 children in a family that relied on welfare for most of her childhood. She graduated from Smith College, and she works for a local economic development organization. And she's now a mom herself. She has a daughter and a stepson. I think they're both in kindergarten. And she and her 2 younger siblings also graduated from college. And they vowed that the cycle of poverty and welfare dependency ends with them. So this is a picture of Tommy Thompson and his wife, and I think that Tommy Thompson's wife is holding either Ngozi or Ngozi's sister. And this is Ngozi here, and that's her mom, Hafiza. So Hafiza was a very active welfare rights activist, and she took her kids to all these protests, and she would protest at rallies against Tommy Thompson and his policies. And she spent 10 years, she got her college degree, and she went to work for Tommy Thompson. She's just an amazing woman. Here's Ngozi and the 3 siblings. So the 3 younger siblings, I have to say, and I think Ngozi would agree, are much better off than the older ones. And I think a lot of that is attributed to the fact that they did go to college. So not everyone has fared the same. They have the older siblings, some are doing well, some are struggling. The oldest brother has run into some problems and is incarcerated. But these 3 are so tough on each other. There's lots of ironies here. They are very staunch conservative Republicans, and they don't believe that people should be on welfare for very long. They believe it should be strictly temporary, and that it should only be for emergencies when you need a hand up, not a handout. And so they said the cycle ends with them. So Akwe is her brother. He's a gentle, sensitive soul, I would say. And he got laid off from his job, and they beat up on him so much that he had a total anxiety attack and ended up in the hospital for a few days. Yeah, they don't sanction sitting around your house on your butts. And when Ngozi was pregnant and between jobs, they berated her, and they told her that she was just going to sit home and get fat, dumb, and happy, and she wasn't having that. And so she went back to work. And so you'll meet her later this afternoon as well. So This is just, people who I think, kind of illustrate the larger problem. I have lots of other people that are part of the story. And what I'm trying to get at is to just understand how people get into poverty, how people try to get out of it, and what are the structures that can hurt or help them, and how well-intentioned legislation and government policies can sometimes really work against the goals of the program, and why legislation like the welfare reform law should be tinkered with, or it should, when they see parts of it are not working, they should change it. And there's been a lot of kind of reluctance to do that. And people just want to say it was a success, but really there are lots of people who are struggling still, and who we've forgotten. I mean, there was a time when everyone was talking about welfare reform, and now I don't think anyone does. But when we think about the level of poverty in this country, we're really still talking about some of the same people. I'm sorry, this is Ngozi and her partner and the children. So I'll just leave it there, and I guess we can take your questions. That's it. Okay.
Any questions? Any questions? Please. Thank you.
So journalists follow up on stories like this when they get a chance. Do you think the government actually does? I mean, having instituted these reforms and then made such a big deal about their importance, do you have any sense that governments anywhere, either federal or state, have just seen what the results were?
No, I mean, I think, for instance, there are certain lawmakers like Gwen Moore, who's from here, and she's a former welfare mom herself. She's tried the whole time she's been in Congress to introduce legislation that would address some of the problems in the law, and it gets nowhere. But there are lots of academics, there are researchers who do these studies, and they say, it's been a dismal failure. When Clinton passed the law, 5 people who were helping him craft it, I mean, some of the leading experts and the leading minds on welfare reform, Peter Edelman, David Elwood at Harvard, they were so angry because a lot of the safety nets that they said that they would put in the law when they were negotiating with the other side, all of them were taken out. And so the law was created without the safety nets that people on both sides believed could really end welfare as we know it. Didn't happen. And so they all quit in frustration. There was Mary Jo Bain. I don't know if you were around those times, you remember how embarrassing it was. And they wrote really, really harsh op-eds and went on the assault against Clinton. And they said everything he promised to do was not, and that he kind of compromised too much because he wanted this legislation passed, but that it was mean-spirited. It was, at the time being led by Newt Gingrich. It was during that whole time when welfare, moms were demons. After the Reagan era, when they were mythologized as welfare queens. So, and right now, I mean, we have so much other economic challenges. I don't think that there's a big outcry to really address these issues.
Marjorie, we're seeing a huge increase in violence this year in Milwaukee, similar to levels that we haven't seen in 20 years. And as we're exploring that issue, we're hearing from people that the level of despair in the poorest part of the cities is at a height that a lot of people have never seen before. And part of that, from what we've heard so far, is being tied to the Great Recession, where most of America has come out of the Great Recession okay. It hit the poor people harder, and they haven't come out of it yet, at least in the neighborhoods of Milwaukee. What have you seen in doing this reporting from the impacts of the Great Recession on welfare reform and the people that were affected by welfare reform?
What have I seen?
Right.
I mean, I think that there is a lot of despair, and I think it's because people who felt that they were getting a toehold maybe into the middle class now feel that it's out the question, especially for, with men. And so when the men don't work, they can't really be active participants in the lives of their children, right? And so there's all these families with absentee fathers, and people think it's just a simple thing of these men not wanting to be in these kids' lives. But I think the bigger problem is that they feel like they have nothing to contribute to these kids' lives. But there is, I feel that there's a bigger sense of anger and a sense of desperation and a sense of nothing is going to change. What are we going to do? And it seems to me like I'm writing the same stories I was writing back in the 90s. And it is concerning. And, I don't know how that equates with crime, except that we know that, there tends to be more crime when there's an increase in poverty. But I don't know if I can make the correlation with that and people with welfare.
One thing that we've heard initially, we're exploring it, I don't know how good the information is, but is that because especially men, many have records, and so it's even harder to find a job. When they can't find a job, they're still going to find a way to live, and that increases the black market, increases crime. That becomes their job. Have you seen much evidence of that?
In fact, one of my sidebars is on that issue. And under the Obama administration and with Eric Holder, they've been trying to change the sentencing guidelines, but also I don't know if it's a policy or a law change, but where you wouldn't have to tell your criminal background on the application, but maybe after the first interview. There's definitely a movement to try to change that, but the criminal records are a huge factor for men getting jobs, and there's a lot of social service organizations that help them with that. But that's a big issue. And even for low wage jobs, even jobs that don't require security clearances.
So you mentioned that one of the families that you got to know, who I think is here right now, happened to be a little more conservative politically, and I'm wondering if that was a trend that you noticed in a lot of the families.
No.
Okay.
No, it wasn't a trend. I mean, I think, and that's why I thought that we're such a fascinating family. I mean, black folks are not traditionally Republicans, but there are people who are, and that they're independent thinkers, and I think it's. They're very much about being self-sufficient and, writing their own narratives and not having the government involved in their lives. And for them, is what works. I mean, Ngozi and I have had lots of discussion, like, how is this that you are? And she just says because she thinks that her views and the views of her family more closely align with Republican thinking. She's also, I believe, a treasurer for the Milwaukee County Republican Party. Yeah. Recently elected? Yes. Okay.
Marjorie, I know you spent some time interviewing Governor Thompson. Can you give us a sense of that interview? Does he have any regrets looking back about how it played out or what he did? What were his thoughts?
In fact, that's a great question. He does. I'm doing a sidebar on just our time. I think we had like a 3-hour dinner. He said for the most part, he still thinks that he helped these women transform their lives. And he told me before he did anything, he and his wife had these regular luncheons at the house where they would invite groups of women on welfare. And they said, how can we help you? What do we need to do to make this work for you? And some women talked about childcare, and he said, so they put a childcare piece in there. Some women said, I need to get an education. I can't keep working these dead-end jobs. And there was an education component, but state lawmakers took that out. And that's his biggest regret. He says to this day, he felt like, even though it was going to cost a lot of money, he felt it would have been worth it in the end. He got weepy with me and said that, I don't know if it's because he's at a stage in his life where he's looking back instead of forward, I don't know. But he said that he was proud of the work, but that he felt like there had been some mistakes made. He felt that Oh, he also was very mad that he didn't get any credit from Bill Clinton. He said basically Bill Clinton took all the credit for what was his policies. But he felt that what has happened here in the state was not what he had in mind. And so he feels like some of the bad stuff will always be kind of aligned with his name. And so he said he always knew it was going to be expensive. He wishes they had even spent more. He said he wishes he had been much more aggressive about it. But I think that he really believes that, you know, his heart was in the right place. And he said he still gets letters from these women who he met along the way. And he said he got a letter from one young lady who said, she said, "Dear Governor Tommy, you know, I didn't know why, but I was taught to hate you because, you know, you made our families struggle. But I want you to know that I'm a lawyer now, and I did this and I did that, and I think it was because you kind of forced my family to do this." And so, yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about your process for finding the families and how difficult that was?
Oh, it was so hard. So me and my student researchers, we spent a couple of days at the Journal Sentinel and went through old clips. And we also did online, and we looked for stories from 20 years ago that quoted welfare moms. And we just created a database, and we did public record searches and just started calling people. But you know, a lot of folks, their lives are constantly in flux. So I mean, I might have had a stack this big, and I did not find most of them. And then there were other people who didn't want to talk, and those that just felt like, you know, the last thing I need is to be talking to a reporter. But I found a lot of people who said, you know, I'm glad that someone wants to hear what I have to say. And so it's a lot of, you know, tracking people down. And then there was people I spent like 6 months with, and then they just disappeared or didn't want to talk to me anymore. If something would change in their life, I was, again, the last thing they wanted to deal with. So it was very hard, but like I did get a good group of women. And you remember yesterday I talked about how the day before I left town, I got all of them together because I felt like they all had something they could help each other out with. And you know, for the most part, it was a good experience because a lot of them really let me into their lives and shared their stories with me. And I felt, you know, like I learned a lot about, you know, how much poverty can permeate every aspect of your life. You know, things that, there was one young lady who's a young mom, and she's, you know, she has a twin, 2-year-olds. She has no car. She lives in Waukesha, you know, because she went there because she needed a job. There were no jobs in Milwaukee, and she lived in a really bad neighborhood. But there's no buses in Waukesha that start early enough to get her to the child care center. So she wraps up these babies and she walks with them, you know, at 4 a.m. to take them to a child care center. Then she goes home and changes and gets on the bus. And her life was just budgeted down to the penny. And everything, there was no room for any error. And this was her daily existence. And she just seemed so tired but so determined that she was going to find a way to make it. And I looked at her life and I thought, what kind of future are these kids going to have, you know? And of course, we read stories all the time about somebody who, you know, grew up with nothing and just, you know, kind of catapulted right to MIT. But those happy stories, they're really the exception. They're not the norm. The norm are people who are either just kind of making it but not getting here, and then, or a lot of people who are just on a downward slide, where it's hard to see how their kids can overcome it. You know, your circumstances of your birth, you know, you can work against them, but when there are so many structural forces, it's not always going to be easy to get out.
Well, and to piggyback on what you're saying right there, the whole idea, I mean, how much of it teeters on where the living wage is, where the minimum wage is. Not everybody is going to go to college. Not everybody is going to have education to allow them, you know, the opportunity for other jobs. But I know stories where people will get a job at a Walmart, and when you're filling out the forms at Walmart and getting your benefits or you know, filling out the paperwork, they will tell you, here's the address for 12th and Valete. Go down there and get your food stamps and get your, how many corporations are employing people at that level that they know they're going to need benefits, public assistance, because they're not getting enough. So I wonder if there's a way, as journalists, we could get some data, get some information on what sort of how many people are actually employed.
Yeah.
Corporations and making just barely on the edge, because
yeah.
it seems
and
like
Walmart's
that's
a good example
the sweet
too.
spot right there.
Walmart's a good example because a lot of Walmart employees are on welfare, and some of these companies, they get tax breaks for hiring them. You know, and not only are they living, they're not getting, a living wage, they're not getting any benefits, so they don't have 401k plans, they don't have pension plans, they don't have college funds, and so they're just living check to check. But that's a good idea about, trying to see these companies. But unless, if they're private companies, it's really hard to get, and they're not going to share that with you. But I do think that places like Walmart, that we could find that out. Yeah, that's a good idea.
While you were speaking, you talked about the childhood poverty rate, and I remembered hearing recently that I want to say 20%, 1 in 5 children in the United States. Mm-hmm. Do you happen to know what the child poverty rate was back in 20 years ago?
I have statistics, but I don't have those with me. But, it's definitely on the increase again. But it did go down for a while. And then people, on the other side of the debate, conservatives would argue that, so they don't get as much welfare, but there are other things like the earned income tax credit. There are lots of other programs that help undergird, that these are social safety nets. That in fact, that when you add all these things up, that welfare moms are better off than before. But, you'd have to go walk in their shoes and see that's not true. So, yeah, but I don't know what it is right offhand, Linda, but it is on the increase.
Yeah, okay.
And it's pretty high here, too, in the state of Wisconsin, and Milwaukee especially. Yeah.
Marjorie, what role does housing play in this? Has there also been, I believe there's been reforms in public housing or public assistance for housing. Does this work hand in hand with what's happened here?
You're saying there's been reforms in public housing?
Changes in the way it's administered or?
Yeah. Well, there's a constant waiting list for Section 8 housing, and a lot of folks don't want to rent to people who are receiving Section 8. And there's a movement away from these big public housing complexes. But poor people are most of the time kind of, clustered in some of the worst neighborhoods with some of the least services, in food deserts, and all this stuff, affects the children, right? How they're brought up and their own health. There's huge rates of asthma in children who live in public housing. That's not a coincidence. But is that what you were asking? Or you're saying how does housing policy fit into this?
Yeah, I'm wondering. We hear so much about how where you live determines part of it.
Yeah, zip codes.
You can't afford to live in a place. So
Yeah.
I'm just wondering how housing policy has evolved alongside this.
Yeah, well, they don't work in tangent. And what's the zip code here? The poorest zip code in Milwaukee? 06. Yeah, and so there's also a lot more research on what is the effect of living in a cluster where everyone is struggling, and again, how do you break out of that? So, yeah.
Marjorie, if you were standing in front of a room full of lawmakers in Wisconsin, what 2 or 3 things would you suggest to them maybe would help?
I think the first piece I would talk about is education. I mean, I feel like it's most likely the ticket out of poverty. If you have an education, you have more options. And so, it became kind of, like really controversial. People were saying, well, I'd like to go to college. I'm not on welfare, but no one's paying for me to go to college. Why should tax dollars be spent paying for people on welfare? They should find a way to go to college on their own. So I think that would be one issue that I would definitely think that they need to address. And again, Gwen Moore's legislation looks at that. I think the child care piece, is still problematic, but I think that's gotten better. But I think the child care subsidy is still very low. And so I think the children of poor people don't get good child care. And, they've been trying to expand the Head Start program, and that's politically controversial as well. I think I would ask you guys for the third. What's the third thing that you think needs to change, Linda or Jackie? Yes.
You have to be very, very, very low income to get Head Start. So if we're talking about changing poverty, that's a different conversation related to like welfare, because we're talking about them in tandem, but in reality, the working poor or the people in poverty or the individuals who are working in poverty don't want to be a part of that system really need additional supports. Once you deal with that issue, you can move it then down to this welfare conversation, because now in 2014-15 they changed the I'm saying welfare, but it's called something else. Whatever the benefits to individuals in need get.
TANF?
TANF, whatever they get is, different. So we have to have two different conversations, one around working poor, so when individuals move out of like the TANF system, that there's some supports for them, and then when there's welfare or TANF, temporary assistance to needy families, that's a different conversation because they're all treated in different ways. But the Head Start program, child care is very, very important for individuals in need, regardless of welfare, TANF, working on the margin. So.
Yeah, and some states, have gotten exemptions where they can try innovative things, and in some places it's working really well. Like, it used to be like, if they track down the father, they collect child support from the father, then the welfare benefits shrink. If the mother gets a job and makes a little bit of money, then, sometimes you need like the cushion between maybe 3 months while they've just started working. Because if they're working at Walmart, they're probably making the minimum wage. They might make like $10 over whatever the limit is. And then they're like, okay, you're on your own. And so, but now some states are letting the women say, okay, if you get off welfare, but you can still keep the child care component, and we'll still give you assistance if you have to commute to the suburbs from the city, because the suburbs are where the jobs are now. We'll pay for your transportation and give them passes. So there's a lot of innovation happening, but a lot of states just want their numbers to go down because they look good, and they have to meet these federal guidelines. And so in Wisconsin, it was just like, just get them off, and also try to keep more people from coming on. And so they would put people through the ringer who were just applying for welfare, and they would just discourage them from applying. So the numbers looked really good on paper, but the reality on the ground was pretty devastating.
Okay, so this is a great pause from this conversation until after our lunch, so we'll be able to pick this back up. I just wanted to end. You mentioned a couple members of Congress, but our Congresswoman, the one Congresswoman here is Gwen Moore. You interacted with her, correct? Can you just share quickly about that as part of your reporting?
My conversations with her?
You talk with her, right? How is she in this?
Yeah. And, she's, a non-apologetic about welfare being necessary. She felt that, she got it when she needed it. It was a safety net that is there for that, and she used it. And, she was able to go to school. She went to Marquette, in fact. And now she's a congresswoman, and she is the poorest member of Congress. She doesn't have a lot of money, but she's a really good advocate, I think, having lived it herself for poor people. I don't know what the chances of her legislation is. I don't think it's good, because she's gotten a few co-sponsors, but it's just not an issue that people are really talking about now. I mean, we are talking a lot about income inequality, but we're not talking about it just in terms of people on welfare. We're talking about it in terms of what's happening in this country. So,
all right. Thank you. Okay. Let her know what you think of her presentation.